Please have a seat. Dick Lucas is now 97 years old, but for many years he was the rector at the Anglican Church St. Helens Bishopsgate, which is a church right in the heart of the financial district in London. And of all the people I heard preach and teach on preaching while I lived in the UK and Ireland, Dick Lucas was one of the ones from whom I definitely learnt the most. But one of my favorite illustrations concerning Dick Lucas concerned an essay that he had read in which the author wrote this: "I'd love to believe in God, I really would, but it's impossible. I would believe in God if someone would just give me a watertight argument, a watertight proof without a single hole, one from which there's no escaping. Then I could believe," end quote. And Dick Lucas's response to that was this. He said, "I don't think God has provided us with a watertight argument, though I know some disagree with me. What God has provided you and me with is a watertight person with no holes in him. There's no escaping him. Jesus Christ is the watertight person against whom, in the end, there can be no argument," end quote. We're currently in a sermon series where we're exploring the authentic Jesus, taking a close look at the primary sources of the gospel to better understand who this watertight person Jesus is, what he came to do, and why he matters. And today we come to the topic of Jesus and his authoritative teaching, which frankly for a preacher is rather daunting. If you've ever had or seen one of those Bibles that puts all of Jesus' words in red letters, well, that's essentially what we've got to cover today. I hope you don't have any other plans for later on today. In fact, by one calculation, even if you were to remove all the duplicated sayings of Jesus, that still leaves us with 31,426 words. Well, you'll be glad to hear we're going to narrow our focus a little bit on what Jesus taught and look at the Sermon on the Mount. In fact, not at the entire sermon, but just the conclusion of the sermon where Jesus brings the sermon to the end. And part of the reason for looking at this as our example of his authoritative teaching this morning is because of what the gospel writer Matthew tells us was the reaction of the crowds to the sermon when Jesus came to the end. Here's what Matthew says in chapter 7, verse 28 to 29. "When Jesus had finished saying these things, the crowds were amazed at his teaching because he taught as one who had authority, not as their teachers of the law." Matthew tells us that Jesus' audience were blown away by his teaching, and specifically they were blown away by the authority with which he taught. Their regular diet of preaching came from the scribes whom they'd listened to in the synagogue every Sabbath. And these were men who, as one person has put it, were in bondage to quotation marks. They loved to quote their rabbinic authorities over and over again. Rabbi Hillel says this, but on the other hand, Rabbi Gamaliel has said this. And then there is the testimony of Eleazar. It was confusing, it was secondhand, and it was probably rather boring. But not so with Jesus. The crowds were amazed at his teaching because he taught as one who had authority. So what we're going to look at this morning is the conclusion of this sermon, a sermon that has been dubbed by some the greatest sermon ever preached, in order to see three things about Jesus' teaching and the authority with which he taught. First of all, the breadth of his teaching. Secondly, the depth of his teaching. And thirdly, the benevolence of his authority. So the breadth of his teaching, the depth of his teaching, and the benevolence of his authority. So follow along, if you will, with Matthew 7, 12 to 29. You'll find it in your orders of service this morning. We're reading from the NIV today, beginning verse 12. "So in everything do to others what you would have them do to you, for this sums up the law and the prophets. Enter through the narrow gate, for wide is the gate and broad is the road that leads to destruction, and many enter through it. But small is the gate and narrow the road that leads to life, and only a few find it. Watch out for false prophets. They come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they are ferocious wolves. By their fruit you will recognize them. Do people pick grapes from thorn bushes or figs from thistles? Likewise, every good tree bears good fruit, and a bad tree bears bad fruit. A good tree cannot bear bad fruit, and a bad tree cannot bear good fruit. Every tree that does not bear good fruit is cut down and thrown into the fire. Thus by their fruit you will recognize them. Not everyone who says to me, 'Lord, Lord,' will enter the kingdom of heaven, but only the one who does the will of my Father who is in heaven. Many will say to me on that day, 'Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name, and in your name drive out demons, and in your name perform many miracles?' And I will tell them plainly, 'I never knew you. Away from me, you evildoers.' Therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like a wise man who built his house on the rock. The rain came down, and the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against that house, yet it did not fall, because it had its foundation on the rock. But everyone who hears these words of mine and does not put them into practice is like a foolish man who built his house on sand. The rain came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against that house, and it fell with a great crash." When Jesus had finished saying these things, the crowds were amazed at his teaching, because he taught as one who had authority and not as their teachers of the law. This is the word of the Lord. It's trustworthy and true, and it's given to us in love. Pray with me, please. Lord, may the words of my mouth and the meditation of all our hearts be found acceptable to you, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. So first of all, the breadth of Jesus' teaching. Look again with me at verses 13 to 14 near the beginning of the passage. Jesus says, "Enter through the narrow gate, for wide is the gate and broad is the road that leads to destruction, and many enter through it. But small is the gate and narrow the road that leads to life, and only a few find it." Jesus here is speaking of two roads, two ways, and he says one of these ways leads to life, and one of these ways leads to destruction. He's using categories here that I imagine interest all of us, whether we would consider ourselves this morning Christian or not, because no one here tends to want to be on the road that leads to destruction. We desire to be on the path that leads to life. And so Jesus here actually is addressing one of the most fundamental questions we ask as human beings. How do I find the path that leads me to a true and authentic life? How do I find the path that leads to satisfaction and joy and flourishing that we were all sensed that we were made for? If that feels like a modern question, it's actually not. It's as old as human thinking itself, and through history we have many examples of thoughtful philosophers, Plato, Aristotle, Seneca, just to name a few in the Western tradition, who have asked such questions. But what's interesting here is that it almost seems like Jesus himself jumps into the fray, addressing the same question as these ancient philosophers, that he presents his teaching as a way of life, as a philosophy of life that leads to life. Now, I have to confess that perhaps like many of you, I've never really thought of Jesus' authoritative teaching as a category of philosophy of life. And that is until I recently read a book by the New Testament scholar called Jonathan Pennington. The book was called Jesus, the Great Philosopher. For some of us, perhaps to call Jesus a philosopher sort of sullies his reputation because we don't have an awfully high view of philosophy or philosophers. Along those lines, Pennington, in his book, quotes from a 1970s stand-up routine of the comedian Steve Martin, in which Martin is reflecting upon his college experience and what he called the intellectual thing. In the routine, Martin observes that people forget most of what it is they were taught where they were in school. For example, he says geology doesn't stick because it's all facts and figures. But he says philosophy's different. When you study philosophy in college, Martin notes, you remember just enough to screw you up for the rest of your life. But here's the thing. Historically, philosophy screwing up your life is not what it was intended to do. Philosophy in the ancient world was the scaffolding and the guide by which men and women sought out the path to true happiness and flourishing. It provided the vision for the good life. And consequently, it shouldn't surprise us that throughout the ancient church and right up until the modern day, Christians have thought about their faith not just in terms of a religion, but as a philosophy of life. Right after World War I, some archaeologists stumbled upon the ancient city of Dura Europos, located in modern-day Syria, right on the Euphrates River. And amongst other discoveries, the researchers found a house church frozen in time since the 2nd century AD. And on the walls of that church were preserved these painted images. They were painted images of Jesus used as teaching tools. So there were depictions of Jesus as a good shepherd, Jesus as the great physician, and Jesus as the philosopher. In fact, in all the pictures of Jesus healing and teaching and performing miracles, he's wearing the telltale philosopher's robes. He's standing in the posture of a philosophy teacher. He's even portrayed with a haircut that indicated his status as a philosopher. Now you might wonder, what's the reason for trying to make the case that Jesus' authoritative teaching fits as a philosophy of life? Well, Jonathan Pennington suggests that the church has been diminished as a result of us losing this philosophy category or language to think about our faith. He writes that in losing this category, our Christian faith often becomes disconnected from so many aspects of our regular human lives, such that Christianity becomes reduced to a religion, reduced to just the vertical dimension of our lives, and we fail to recognize the breadth of Jesus' teaching as a philosophy of life that's to permeate every nook and cranny of our everyday lives, affecting our relationships and justice and money and use of our time and our work. And when we do that, when we reduce Christianity like that, we end up then looking to other sources, sort of alternative gurus in our lives for the wisdom that we crave. And it's not that you can't find wisdom in other places in this life. It's not like you and I can't learn something from the likes of Marie Kondo or Jordan Peterson or whoever else you would count as your bench of influences in life. Of course you can. But if you find yourself going to these other sources all the time to look for the wisdom, if you find you're quoting these people to your friends consistently, if you find yourself thinking to yourself, WWJD, what would Jordan do? That's it's going to be a red flag. If that's where you're going instead of going to Jesus and his teaching that encompasses the broadest philosophy of life, impacting every decision, every relationship, every thought, every word, every deed. But circle back with me then to what Jesus actually says here about this way in verses 13 to 14. Let me read it again. Enter through the narrow gate, for wide is the gate and broad is the road that leads to destruction, and many enter through it. But small is the gate and narrow the road that leads to life, and only a few find it. The way that Jesus describes these two ways is actually a bit surprising, isn't it? Because the gate that leads to life, Jesus says, is narrow. That's not normally considered a terribly positive word in our culture. If I was to describe someone as narrow or narrow-minded, you wouldn't think that I'm making a compliment about the person. And then in contrast, Jesus says the road that leads to destruction is broad. That's a word we would tend to see more positively. If I say someone's broad-minded, you think of someone who at least is generally pleasant to be around. But Jesus here turns the expected usage of both of those words upside down. The thing, he says, that looks very broad leads into suffocatingly narrowness, deadly narrowness. And the thing that looks narrow leads to astonishing vastness and breadth and freedom. Those of you who might be Doctor Who fans, it kind of, this narrow way reflects the TARDIS phenomenon. For those of you who are unfamiliar with the British TV character, Doctor Who travels through time in this TARDIS, which really just looks like this glorified police phone booth. But the entrance to the TARDIS is very narrow, and then he goes inside, and it's just vast inside. But here Jesus is saying, if you take the alternatives to his teaching, while they may look so wide and open and spacious and affirming on the outside, when you get on the inside of this way, you find it's incredibly cramped and narrow, and it leads to suffocation. And in contrast, he says the gospel on the outside, with its exclusive claims about who Jesus is and what he calls on you to do and what he came to do, it all can look incredibly narrow, but when you come inside, you discover that it is unbelievably spacious. It's the place of flourishing. It's the place of life. So there is this breadth to Jesus' teaching as it entails this whole philosophy of life. But secondly, there's a depth to Jesus' teaching as well. Recently, my wife, Tara, and I were watching a TV drama series that a friend had recommended to us. But to be honest, after watching the first episode, we weren't too sure whether we really wanted to persevere with it. It wasn't that it was in Norwegian with subtitles. That actually was okay. But it was just that while we watched the first episode, it just seemed really hard to track what was going on and to know who was who in the show. But we decided we'd persevere. We started watching the second episode. At which point we realized that by me clicking on the wrong icon on the screen, we had actually started with the 8th episode, the final episode of the series, instead of the first. So lo and behold, we started with the first, and when we made it all the way through the end to the 8th episode, it made an awful lot more sense. But the thing is that sometimes getting a peek of the conclusion of something before starting into the body of the work actually can be quite instructive. Maybe not with fiction or with drama, but at least with nonfiction works, having an idea of the conclusion gives you a better sense of the arc of the book's thesis and its overall argument. And that's because a good conclusion is going to tell you what was in the body of the book. If it's in the conclusion, it's probably in the body as well. And sermons tend to work the same way. Conclusion will summarize what's been said beforehand. Now, Jesus' Sermon on the Mount covers an awful lot of territory. But as with any good sermon, Jesus here in the conclusion is summing up everything that he's been saying up to this point. And he does so, as we just read, by a series of contrasting images. He says, as we've just seen, there are two ways. And then he goes on to say there are two trees, and one tree produces good fruit, one tree produces bad fruit. And then he goes on to talk about two houses. One's built on a firm foundation, the other's built on sand. But with each picture, Jesus is challenging his listeners to discern which way, which tree, which house reflects their particular situation. So think with me about this for a moment. If Jesus is talking in the conclusion about two ways, two trees, two houses, then when you go back into the body of the sermon, you should be able to find those two ways depicted, right? So in light of what does come beforehand in the Sermon on the Mount, you'd say, well, what are the two ways? And when many people conclude, well, that's a no-brainer. I mean, we're in the category of religion here, and all religions do the same thing. They set people apart so that you've got the good people and the bad people. You've got the nice people and the nasty people. You've got the religious people and the irreligious people. That's how religions work. They differentiate between those two groups. And so that people think those must be the two ways that Jesus is contrasting here. Basically, the good and the bad, the religious and the irreligious, the righteous and the unrighteous. It's just there's a problem with that interpretation when you go back into the body of the Sermon on the Mount, because it's not the contrast that Jesus is making that often people assume. Jesus is not teaching that on the one hand, there are the good people of the world, and then there are the bad people of the world. The religious people on the one hand, and the irreligious people. And perhaps the clearest example of this comes in the middle chapter of the Sermon on the Mount, chapter 6. Jesus is about to teach on the Lord's Prayer, but just before that, he's teaching on prayer in general. And when you go back and you look at what Jesus says there, it's actually quite surprising. He says, it's not that the good people are the people who pray and the bad people are the people who don't pray. No, he says, there are people who pray this way, but I want you to pray this way. And then he goes on to talk about giving. He says it's not that, the good people in the world, they're the givers, and the bad people in the world, they're the stingy people, they don't give. No, he says, there are people who give in this manner, but I want you to give in that manner. So that in the sermon, Jesus is contrasting two ways, but it's not a case of one kind of in our category being good and one in our category being bad. Actually, on the surface, the people that he's contrasting, they all actually look good. Because both are actually doing the right things. They're all giving, they're all praying, they're doing spiritual disciplines, and yet Jesus comes to the end in the sermon and he says, one of those ways that I was talking about back in chapter 6, it's actually toxic. One of those ways reeks like rotten fruit. One of those ways approaches to life is going to come crashing down. One of these paths leads to destruction. The big surprise in Jesus' teaching in the Sermon on the Mount is that the people on the narrow way and the people on the broad way are actually doing the exact same things. They're doing the same things. They're all praying, they're all giving, they're all fasting. So then the question is, okay, well, what is it that distinguishes one of these groups from the other? And here's what distinguishes the two groups. The two groups do these acts for completely different reasons. The contrast that Jesus lays out is all about a posture of the heart. It's all about our motivations. So that there is this depth to Jesus' teaching all the way through the Gospels, this heart depth to his teaching. I mean, think about it this way. Here we all are this morning, filling the pews, and from a certain perspective, we're all looking pretty good. And I'd say you are. You look marvelous this morning. But you think, so I'm in church. I mean, some of us might think, by definition, that has me on the way to life. That has me as the tree that's producing good fruit. It has me as the house that's built on a firm foundation. And Jesus comes and he says, not so fast, not so fast. He says, I'm actually more interested to know the reason that you're here than for the fact that you're here. Sure, you're here, but who are you here for? Because some, Jesus is saying in the Sermon on the Mount, some do things like come to church so that others will see them and praise them. I mean, you and I can look the part of the devoted follower of Jesus on a Sunday morning, but if our true motivation for being here is in order to gain a certain reputation, or to network for career goals, or in order to be noticed or lauded by one particular person who's also here, Jesus, by the time he gets to the end of the sermon, he's saying, you should be hearing blaring sirens right now. Because he says, if that's you, if that's your general MO in life, you're on the broad way that leads to destruction. Your fruit stinks. Your house is built to collapse. You're doing the right things, but you're not the right kind of person because your heart's all wrong. And in contrast, he says, for those whose hearts are right, who are on the narrow way, who ironically are doing all the same things, singing the same songs, praying the same prayers. He says, you're doing the things, if you're on the narrow way, for the right reasons, which is basically because you love God and you love the people around you. And I'd suggest that even includes some of us here today who would say, I don't know that I'm a Christian yet, or I know I'm not a Christian yet. But you're serious in your search, you're genuine in your exploration of Jesus and his claims, and in Jesus' analysis, you're much closer to the way that leads to life than those of us who might be here today who are doing all the right things, but for all the wrong reasons. Because Jesus says that puts us on the road that leads to destruction. Do you see the difference? One way uses God to get things. The other way, the good way, uses things to seek God and to find God. Same actions, completely different motives. Because it all has to do with the heart. There's not just this breadth of Jesus' teaching. There's also this depth that penetrates to demanding a certain posture of the heart. Thirdly and lastly, though, we come to Jesus' benevolent authority. Look with me again at verse 24 and then jump to 26. Jesus says, therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like a wise man who built his house on the rock. Verse 26, but everyone who hears these words of mine and does not put them into practice is like a foolish man who built his house on sand. Now notice the intended emphasis of Jesus here, where he's bringing attention upon himself. It's not just those who do my words, it's those who do these words of mine. It's somewhat subtle, but it's significant. It's in contrast to the scribes of Jesus' day and their endless quoting of various rabbis. Here Jesus makes the massively audacious and scandalous claim that his words are authoritative, that his words need to be acted upon, that everything in your life and my life depends fundamentally upon whether we do what Jesus says or we don't do what Jesus says. That he says the stability and the fruitfulness and the flourishing of your life depends on whether you will do what he says. No one in Jesus' day spoke or taught like this. Now, of course, Jesus would not be the first leader, nor the last, to command obedience to what he teaches and to make promises about the benefits of that kind of obedience. So the question is, what would make you choose to put into practice to follow after Jesus' teaching as opposed to the teaching of someone else in this world? I'm guessing that for some of you here today who wouldn't claim to be Christians yet, you've either read or you've heard through the grapevine something of Jesus' commands, and to be honest, you would say, yeah, that sounds pretty narrow to me. Narrow would be an appropriate description of what Jesus teaches. And let me tell you, if that's what you think, you're not alone. His commands challenge all of us here, Christian and non-Christian, in the arena of areas of integrity and of sex and politics, of our work, of our consumption, of our money. And the question is, why would you ever submit yourself to such stringent, challenging commands? And let me suggest to you that our willingness to do what Jesus commands, to do the what of Jesus' teaching, all depends on whether we grasp the who of the teaching and the why of the teaching. First, it all depends on the who of the teaching. Jesus understood this himself, which is why all through the Gospels, Jesus' teaching, no matter what the subject matter, it eventually circles back around to teaching about himself. I wonder if you've ever noticed this. Jesus in the Gospels is constantly talking about himself. It's said in this world that there are two types of people. There are here I am kind of people, and there are there you are kind of people. And you've met both kinds. We're probably particularly astute at noticing the first kind. They're the kind of people, the here I am kind of people, are the people that you meet at a party and you're talking to them and they say to you, well, that's enough about me. What do you think about me? And we tend to gravitate away from those kind of people, don't we? And yet here comes Jesus, and he's constantly talking about himself. He's constantly referring to himself, drawing attention to himself. In fact, the self-centeredness of his teaching was one of the things that immediately set him apart from all the other rabbis, all the philosophers of the day. They tended to be self-effacing. The rabbis of Jesus' day would point people away from themselves, saying, okay, yes, that's the truth as I understand it. Follow that. That's the way. Go that way. And then Jesus comes along and he says, this way that leads to flourishing, I'm that way. And this truth that I command you to live by, I'm that truth. And this life that I'm inviting you into, this life that leads to flourishing, I'm that life. He says the reason you should do what I say you should do is because of who I am. I'm the way, I'm the truth and the life. I'm the Son of the living God. I'm the promised King. I'm the Lord of life. The reason we submit to the what of his teaching, first of all, is because of the who of the teaching. But secondly, it's also because of the why of the teaching. It's possible for authority to possess the sheer power to coerce obedience. But Jesus doesn't want to coerce obedience from any of us to his authoritative teaching. He wants you to choose to follow the breadth and the depth of his teaching, which is why in all of Jesus' teaching, indeed in his entire life, there is this kindness, this grace, this benevolence connected to his authority, because his mission was to exercise his authority on our behalf, for us, out of love for us. Jesus was a here I am kind of person, but because he's a there you are kind of person as well. The reason Jesus would keep talking about himself is because his goal was to get you and me onto that way that leads to life and off the way that leads to destruction. And it's only through him that can happen. So let me conclude by just giving you one example of how Jesus taught that, and it has to do with this gate again that we've been reading about. Let me take you back just one more time to verses 13 and 14. Jesus says, "Enter through the narrow gate, for wide is the gate and broad is the road that leads to destruction, and many enter through it. But small is the gate and narrow the road that leads to life, and only a few find it." Have you ever noticed where this gate is located in this picture. I'm not coming down quite yet. For both the road that leads to life and the road that leads to destruction, your entrance through the gate precedes your going on the gate. You see that? The gate's at the start of the road. Other philosophies and religions will tell you that this life is all about, doing your best, trying your hardest, keeping the rules. And if you do that, then you may qualify to get through the gate, but it's at the end of the road. You gotta do the road first. First the road, then if you're good enough on the road, you can get through the gate. But Jesus taught the exact opposite. Jesus says, my way involves first entering through the gate and then following the road beyond the gate that leads to life. So what specifically is this gate that you have to enter first before embarking on this way of life? Well, in the Gospel of John, Jesus gives us the answer. John chapter 10, verse 9, Jesus says, I'm the gate. Whoever enters through me will be saved. They will come in and they will go out and they will find pasture. Jesus says this gate that you need to go through in order to find life, it's me. He says, I'm the gate. That the beginning of the way that leads to life involves opening the door and coming to him, to salvation. And that takes a certain posture of the heart that we were talking about earlier. It takes a certain humility where you're willing to recognize that you don't have the authority to go through that gate because of your record and your reputation. But the good news is that Jesus not only taught authoritatively, it is that he lived authoritatively. And the good news ultimately is that Jesus exercised supreme authority over our greatest enemy of sin and death through his death on the cross, so that all who will enter through Jesus the gate come into the way of life that leads to life. It's in this way that we discover the beauty of the breadth of Jesus' teaching and the humility that is needed because of the depth of his teaching. But it's also in this way, going through Jesus, through this gate, that we discover the spaciousness of this life that he invites us into. And we find out that indeed it is the teaching of this authentic Jesus that really are the words that lead to true life, authentic life, spacious life. Because this Jesus is indeed the watertight person against whom in the end there is no argument. Pray with me. Lord Jesus, we thank you that you have provided us the words of life, not only giving us the way that you have called us to live, but by getting us on that way because you are the gate. You are the one who brings us into this way. Through your teaching about yourself, pointing us to yourself so that we might trust in you. We pray, Lord, that you would give us that breadth of understanding, that we would seek to live for you, and that for any of us here who have not yet gone through the gate, that we would see the beauty of what you have called us to, the beauty of who you are, so that we would find this life that you're inviting us into. We pray this in your name. Amen.